Mr. Gillespie preferred never to deal with travel agencies when he traveled abroad, which happened quite often, for he was a very wealthy gentleman and adored all sorts of adventures. He invariably planned his own routes, using railway timetables and all sorts of reference books and guides, which were almost his reference books. Unfortunately, it also happened that his plans failed, like this time, for example, when the failure turned out to be completely unexpected. He was traveling in the southern part of Europe and, as luck would have it, got stuck on the road. The taxi, if you could call the hired car that, was standing forlornly at the side of the road, hopelessly stuck in deep mud. The car's engine had long since died, and the bewildered driver kept scratching his head in confusion. Mr. Gillespie once again glanced irritably at his watch. It was 12:30, and if he was serious about getting to Zagreb, he had to be in Munich no later than 6. He climbed out of the decrepit car and, finding himself under the rays of the bright sun, which had finally appeared in the sky after several days of continuous rain, immediately began to sweat stickily. After all, he was already in his 70s, and besides, his corpulent build was clearly telling. He really wanted to talk to the driver, but he did not know the local language at all. Then Mr. Gillespie pointed his finger at the stalled engine, then pointed to his wristwatch, clearly making it clear that he wanted to know when they could continue their journey. The answer came immediately, not earlier than 2 hours. Mr. Gillespie sighed resignedly and looked around, although there was not much to see. To the left of the road, a dense, dark forest towered like a solid wall, while to the right, a precipice yawned, stretching beyond the cliff. The shade from the trees beckoned with its refreshing coolness, and so the hapless traveler took out of the trunk of the car a travel bag in which he always carried his painting supplies, threw it over his shoulder and was about to leave. To Mr. Gillespie's obvious surprise, the driver began to hold him back with strange fervor, motioning for him to stay put. With a hand damp with sweat, he grabbed his thick wrist and quickly chattered something in his own language, at the same time looking anxiously into the passenger's eyes. Mr. Gillespie involuntarily felt irritated, shook his head and made another unsuccessful attempt to express himself in English. Then he confidently moved towards the forest. The driver shouted something after him again, but he did not even turn around. Soon both the car and the driver disappeared from sight completely. Now he was surrounded on all sides by the forest, a little mysterious, a little eerie, partly friendly and in some ways impersonal. In the end, Mr. Gillespie began to think that the forest was quite benevolent towards him. True, quite soon he noticed its unusual silence. Not even the singing of birds was heard, although this silence rather suggested to him not so much a hidden hostility as a good disposition towards his own person. He also noticed that the forest was still rather strange. There was no undergrowth at all. There were no fallen leaves, branches or other forest debris anywhere. There were no thickets of bramble, only soft, smooth green grass growing between even and orderly rows of trees that seemed to be artificially planted. Mr. Gillespie was not a botanist and therefore had no idea what these trees were called, although their shade did indeed have the most beneficial effect on him. Bright rays of sunlight broke through the dense crown of the trees, falling in uneven yellowish spots on the lush green grass. As an amateur artist, he could not help but appreciate such a pleasing to the eye range of colors. Coming out into a small clearing, Mr. Gillespie found a convenient stump for sitting, which was almost closely adjacent to one of the trees. In this place, the sun's rays falling on the ground had almost no obstacle in front of them from branches and leaves, which made all the colors seem brighter, richer and created a charming play of light and shadow, falling in an even layer on the soft green grass. Mr. Gillespie slowly took a palette and paints from his bag. It was easy and even pleasant for him to work, his head slightly thrown back, and obedient fingers deftly moved the brush across the sheet of paper. After a while, he nevertheless vaguely felt that, despite all its natural charm, this whole scene was deprived of some important element. For some reason, he wanted to see a little boy in a red jumper at the base of the tree. Looking slightly to the side, Mr. Gillespie literally jumped up in amazement. There really was a little boy sitting near the tree, calmly looking at him. True, he was not wearing a red sweater, but a rather strange outfit, vaguely resembling a sack, with a slit for his head, which barely covered his dirty, thoroughly scratched knees. Otherwise, there was no doubt this was indeed a small boy of flesh and blood. The boy curled his lips, showing his snow-white teeth for a moment, after which he stood up and fearlessly walked towards Mr. Gillespie, stopping a few steps away from him. Slightly lowering his gaze, the artist noticed with disgust that the child was clutching in his palms the bloody remains of some small animal, either caught in a trap or prey to a larger predator. Catching his gaze, the boy grinned again and threw aside the terrible, bloody rags of meat, and then slightly stretched out his lips, threw his head back a little and let out a loud, drawn-out whistle. A moment later, the astonished Mr. Gillespie saw 3 more children emerge from behind the trees, 2 boys and a girl, very similar to the first, dark-skinned, with shining eyes, tousled hair and dressed in the same baggy rags. The children silently looked at the stranger. The first to emerge from the row was a girl approaching Mr. Gillespie. She extended her hand and unexpectedly squeezed his leg just above the knee. Apparently, the result of such an inspection was quite satisfactory to her, since she immediately went over to her friends and said something to them in a quiet voice. They laughed excitedly, opening their mouths wide and flashing their cheerful, shining eyes. Mr. Gillespie was clearly feeling insecure. On the one hand, he felt a certain embarrassment, finding himself under fire from 4 pairs of attentively looking eyes. On the other, he felt obvious annoyance at being unable to talk to them. Instead, he only smiled at them. Their expressions did not change at all. Then he took his unfinished sketch from the easel and showed it to them. Then he suddenly remembered that he had a bar of chocolate in his bag. He quickly unzipped it, took out the delicacy, broke off a small piece and put it in his mouth, in case these poor ragamuffins had never seen anything like it, and handed the rest to the girl. The scene that followed was so wild that Mr. Gillespie stood for some seconds as if struck by lightning, not knowing what he should do. First the girl sniffed the bar of chocolate, bit off a piece and began to chew it intently. At the same moment, the boy sitting next to her snatched the chocolate from her hands. She, naturally, rushed at the offender with a squeal, so that in a few seconds both small bodies were intertwined in a fierce, almost mortal struggle. The children rolled around on the grass. "Stop it!" Mr. Gillespie, who had finally come to his senses, exclaimed sharply. "Stop it right now." It seemed that no one even heard him. The boy continued to squeeze the girl's throat with both hands, while she scratched his face with her nails. Mr. Gillespie could not stand it and, grabbing the boy, abruptly pulled him to his feet, involuntarily amazed at the force with which the child was tearing himself out of his hands. Suddenly he fell silent, somehow went limp, but the girl laughed triumphantly and dexterously jumped to her feet. Then the 4 of them stood around him, clasped their palms, forming a kind of living, dirty brown ring, and, laughing merrily and throwing back their heads, began to run around the astonished man, stamping their bare heels and seeming to involve him in some kind of wild dance. Everything swam before Mr. Gillespie's eyes. He fussed, jerked from side to side, trying to break free from the living ring, but the children's little hands clung to him every now and then and held him firmly in their captivity. At last he managed to break through their encirclement, He immediately sank to the ground, wiping the sweat from his forehead and trying to calm his desperately pounding heart. Meanwhile, the children again formed a semicircle, and, looking at them, Mr. Gillespie involuntarily was amazed at the fact that they seemed not at all out of breath and not even tired, while he still could not catch his breath. At some moment, he again felt a sharp squeeze of his leg just above the knee. This time it was a boy. And again the children exchanged some words. True, now none of them laughed. They all silently and tensely peered into his face. Mr. Gillespie thought that it was time to return to the car. He rose with difficulty, feeling his legs buzzing from the unaccustomed running. The children continued to stand motionless in place. And again the girl came forward, slightly stretching her lips. She stretched out her palms to him, as if hinting that he should take her in his arms and kiss her goodbye. Mr. Gillespie was clearly touched by such a scene. He picked up the child, and the child actually clasped his little arms around his neck. And at the same moment the man felt a disgusting, some kind of animal stench emanating from her unexpectedly opened mouth. Her greenish eyes looked straight into his nose. Suddenly the artist felt a fit of bottomless, chilling horror. With a sharp cry, he tried to free himself from the grip of the children's hands clinging to him. Soon he was already screaming long and wildly, almost howling, while the blonde head continued to bend lower and lower, until her lips reached his throat, and white teeth sank into his soft flesh. And then 3 pairs of tenacious fingers grabbed him by the ankles, jerked him sharply from the unexpected attack. Mr. Gillespie staggered and fell heavily on his back. Now all 4 of them jumped on his chest, stomach, legs. For some time he continued his desperate but useless resistance, even screamed loudly a couple of times, but then he fell completely silent. A few minutes later, all that could be heard on the silent clearing was the abrupt clanking of strong, young teeth. Lost in 3 Pines. The story is not very scary. Such cases are told quite often. But this story was told by my grandfather. So for me this story sounds real. My grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side lived in Latvia on a farm, 7 kilometers from the regional settlement of Izotka. This settlement arose in time immemorial, when old believers were exiled here or they themselves fled from persecution by the authorities. And the area there was remote, like parties in Belarus, swamps, black forests, gullies, windfalls, wild boars and wolves. Well now, of course, it is not the same. What was the farm? A large, wooden manor house and numerous outbuildings, sheds, storerooms, cellars, barns, a barn, a pigsty, a poultry house, vegetable gardens, fields, and all this is surrounded by forests. The fields were huge, no mechanization, hard labor. My grandfather and grandmother worked together. The hardest work was done by the brothers, who lived in the same farms beyond the fields, beyond the forests, several kilometers away. The children, my mother and aunt, also had their own responsibilities, very difficult for their age: cooking, washing, cleaning, collecting brushwood, mowing hay, grazing small livestock, sheep, geese, and a million other things. They had to walk 7 kilometers to school, in winter, in waist-deep snow through a dark forest. In general, life was not easy, even very. Mum told me that in winter, in the dead of night, wolves would come, stand on the porch, and look into the windows. The cattle would go crazy with fear. Then the Soviet power came, and my grandfather shrewdly and voluntarily gave all the land and animals to the collective farm and joined it himself. That's how he avoided dispossession. Then, the war. My grandfather went to the front in the first ranks because he was a communist. And my grandmother had to pull the whole farm and the children herself. The fascists showed up, and the forests were inhabited by Asics, Forest brothers, like our banderates, that is, partisans. Grandma was hung twice. They scared her into revealing where the partisans were hiding. The partisans and fascists sometimes raided the farm and took away food, bread, leg of lamb, eggs, whatever they could find, but Grandma never protested or contradicted either of them, and so she survived. Auntie was sick with typhus. Her hair was cut, and after that it grew curly. They wanted to take Auntie to Germany, but Grandma bribed the village elder, and Auntie's age was reduced in her birth certificate. Having lived through all this, Grandma never complained, but told everything with some optimism, even with laughter, like an interesting fairy tale. She kept a smile until the end of her life. She was an amazing person. May she rest in peace and eternal memory. Grandfather returned from the war as an invalid tuberculosis. Thanks to his grandmother's care and periodic hospital treatment, he lived long enough to see his grandchildren. But he was no longer capable of hard work. And in the end, tuberculosis finished him off. Getting off topic, I want to tell you about a small mystical incident that also happened to my grandfather. My grandfather had a favorite cat, Kotya. When he lay exhausted on the stove, the cat usually lay on his chest. When he was taken to the hospital in Daugavpils for the last time, the cat started crying at night. Grandma crossed herself, also started crying and said, "My Izotka is gone. He died. My grandfather's name was Izot Petrovich." And so it turned out. After that, the cat howled all the time, and then left the house. So don't tell me that dogs are loyal. My grandfather grew up and spent his whole life in these parts. He knew every forest down to the last path, every swamp down to the last hummock. But just imagine, he got lost in 3 pines. He never admitted that he got lost, but stubbornly insisted that the wood goblin was playing a joke on him. An old man walks through the forest, and walks, and the boletus mushrooms are one more beautiful than the other. The old man's nose is buried in the ground. He straightens up, his back aches, and look, holy mothers, where am I? All unfamiliar places. He goes along a clearing thinking, I'll come out on the highway like this. But the clearing suddenly became overgrown. He goes in the other direction, the road ends in a swamp. The old man spat in his heart and stomped straight through the forest. He walks and the forest gets darker and darker, the trees get thicker and thicker, and moss hangs from them. Black firs, 2 spans wide, their lower branches form a tent, and in that tent someone is fiddling and snorting. The old man got scared. He probably thinks it's a wild boar, a terrible animal, strong, aggressive and very fast. The old man, no longer thinking about the road, trotted out of there as quickly and quietly as possible. He ran a little, caught his breath, sat down on a fallen tree. He thought about it, couldn't understand how this could have happened. He got lost in his native forest, which he had walked and walked through. Wherever he turned, there were impassable thickets, windfalls and spruces, thick as baobabs. Under the shade of the trees, the sun was almost invisible, only a weak yellow spot shone through. He started because he had fallen off a log in his sleep. How long have I been sleeping? He thought. He figured, no more than an hour. The sun had set slightly. The grandfather looked around, chose a direction to move in. He went. He walked, but there was no light in sight. It got dark, and the sun had risen higher. The grandfather got scared, looked, and it was the moon. Apparently, he had slept longer than he thought. Finally, the forest seemed to thin out, and lights began to loom ahead. The grandfather was as happy as a child and ran towards these lights. He realized, I went to Potapov's farm, or to Greva. I went too far. I'll spend the night at my brother Potap's. I don't have the strength to get home. And Potap always has some homebrew ready. These are the plans he makes. And, inspired by these plans, he runs without looking. Suddenly there was a squelching sound under his boots. He looked and saw a bare swamp all around, and the lights had disappeared. The old man began jumping from hummock to hummock and wandered into a quagmire. He hesitated, got water in his boots. As soon as he pulled the boots out, he sank waist deep. The old man began to rush about in panic, but remembered in time that twitching and rushing about in the swamp was like death. Then he slowly lay down on his stomach and began to pull himself out of the swell. The swamp did not want to let him go, squelched, gurgled, snorted and even rumbled like a sleepy water nymph. But the old man defeated it. He crawled up to a small island where a crooked, dead tree stood and dry grass grew. He lay face down for a long time, overcome by belated fear. Then he sat up and saw that the lights had appeared again, so close and warm in appearance. But the old man only showed a fig in that direction and added a couple of curse words in a frontline manner. He decided to wait until dawn and not to wander around the swamp at night under any circumstances. He reached to take off his boots and looked. There was only one boot left. The swamp had taken its toll. The old man took off his boot, wrung out his foot wraps and hung them on a tree. He lay down on the dry grass and did not exactly doze off, but rather seemed to freeze. The swamp seemed strange to him, very quiet. Not a night bird would cry out. Not a small animal would rustle. Very quiet, like in a well. It began to turn grey. The old man looked. Sure enough, the swamp was unfamiliar, dead. Usually in their swamps there are various plants, grasses, a lot of water birds, animals and reptiles. There are also whole fields of cranberries. Where it is drier, lingonberries. And here, nothing but dry long-haired grass and dry trees. And between the hummocks, dead swamp lakes, stinking like I don't know what. And what struck Grandpa to the depths of his soul, here and there the grass was braided into pigtails, as if someone was playing. By the way, Grandpa said that night lights were creeping up on him from all sides, as if luring him, as if testing his strength. What if he couldn't stand it and went towards the light? But Grandpa, like a true communist, only extended his invariable fig in that direction and whispered various indecent expressions. When it got light, the old man put on his shoes, broke off a large piece of dry wood and went to clear a swamp. So, from hummock to hummock, sometimes falling through, he swept quite a lot. He looks. An inviting island looms on the course. High, dry. He needs to rest and catch his breath. The old man looks. A twig is stuck on the island, and a red rag is tied to it. He is happy, thinking that someone left a note on the right way. Suddenly the old man sways. He feels sick. Black rags dance before his eyes, and his head is blown, so he became like a drunk. With the last of his strength, he goes to the island, the red rag before his eyes as a landmark. The old man approaches the pole. He was just about to grab hold of it, when suddenly the red rag barks like a fox and runs across the swamp. And the old man runs in the other direction, runs and curses the devils at the top of his voice. Either the famous Russian mother helped, or God pardoned him, an old sinner and soldier. But the grandfather did not drown in the swamp, but jumped out onto a high place. From there he saw cultivated fields and someone's farm. Already missing to boots, the grandfather hobbled to the farm and thought, whose house is this? It seems familiar. I'll go ask kind people to show me the way home. I must have gone very far from home. He comes closer, looks, and this is his home. He entered the house. No one. Sat down on the porch and rested. Suddenly, he sees a crowd of people running and his Maria in front, bareheaded. They ran up, stopped, gaping at him, and the grandmother threw herself on the grandfather's chest. Izotka, Izotka, where have you been? The whole world has been looking for you, everyone screamed. Didn't you hear your name? That's how the goblin led my grandfather. After that, My grandfather was very ill from overwork, but he drank mead regularly. With his son-in-law, that is, with my dad. Over the mead, my grandfather would tell this story every time, always embellishing it. My father would say to him, "Dad, aren't you ashamed? You're an old Bolshevik, and you believe in the devil. You just breathed in the swamp, and it's all just a figment of your imagination." My grandfather would get very angry and, beating his chest, would prove that everything that happened to him that night was true, including the devil's. He couldn't have gotten lost so easily. He couldn't have failed to recognize the area, and there had never been such a swamp there before. And the shining lights. He would cry out, "A swamp rotten thing," they would answer. And the running red scarf. "So Dad, only in Germany are devils red, and here they are black, as it should be. Pierfew on you, let's have a drink." That's how all the arguments ended. After the feast, Grandpa would go to bed, and Daddy would put on a sheepskin coat, turned inside out, and go to the village to scare the people. He couldn't stay at his mother-in-law's without jokes. And my grandfather, may he rest his soul, was convinced for the rest of his life that he had entered into a confrontation with evil spirits and emerged victorious. Sing quietly, I am your fear. I was born and raised in the city, but over time I realized that it is almost impossible to live here. Concrete monsters, the roar of engines, the bustle, the grey dull landscape outside the window, almost destroyed green areas. The urban environment is becoming aggressive. There is no place for simple human happiness. You feel completely different in the village. You can arrange your house as you want. If you want a veranda, a winter garden, a terrace, please. You don't have to share the yard with impudent neighbors. You arrange the adjacent territory to your taste. Here you have a garden, a vegetable garden, a flower bed, a sandbox, a hammock, and a sports ground. You can calmly do your own thing. It is much easier to live in nature, since you don't have to go somewhere specially or go down from the nth floor. You go out and already walk. I spent my childhood in the village. Every summer I spent with my grandmother Toma. There I met Olia, my friend for the summer. Now I remember with increasing intensity how we fooled around and had fun. We played in the fresh air and summoned different spirits, like the evil gnome, the Queen of Spades, and other semi-fairy tale evil spirits. My soul becomes light from warm memories. And now I'm going to my granny again. She's already quite old. I haven't seen her for so long. When I arrived, my granny greeted me with an open heart, with pies and fresh milk. I also found out that Olia was here too. Of course, I decided to meet my old friend. When we saw each other, the whole village heard our cries of joy. We spent 3 days together. Each of us told us about our lives, problems and joys. But still, we city girls got a little bored. "Elisa, you know, I just had an idea," my friend suddenly said. "Do you remember the creepy legends about the local forest? They say that all sorts of mysticism and all that stuff happens there at night. I don't believe it, but I'd like to go. Just for fun. It's dangerous to wander around the forest alone, but it's perfect with 2 people. Imagine, it's such an adrenaline rush. And take your camera. It's good that you have a flash. We'll take some atmospheric photos." For a long time my friend tried to persuade me to this frankly dangerous idea, but I agreed. I never believed in mysticism, but I love to read horror stories at night, sitting at home in safety. I would like to experience something like that, to savor the feeling of something secret and unknown, even if it is just an illusion. We agreed to meet at the mulberry tree and head into the forest. 0:30. As soon as we went behind the first trees and the light of the lanterns was left behind, only the dark silhouettes of giant spruce trees and the forest darkness were visible ahead, my whole body went cold. My soul froze in a tight lump, and my legs, as if wooden, refused to move. My guide crucified my arms and made me open my soul to nature, inhale the spruce scent, trust the forest as my home. After that, my body came out of its stupor a little. I was able to move my legs further. It was clear from her face that she had been enduring this for a long time. Olka quickly thrust the camera and flashlight into my hands and disappeared into the bushes. A minute passed. 3, 5. "Hey, will you be there soon?" I shouted, but no one answered. "Your mother. This is not funny. Come out," I whined angrily, knowing Olia and her jokes. Finally, I began to hear some sounds that I initially attributed to my friend, but I was wrong. Behind me, someone began to sing, no, even sang. In chorus, the song sounded loud and ringing in the empty night forest. It felt like a lot of little children were singing. The lyrics were not clearly audible, but the music was cheerful. This kind of music can be heard at children's parties. I walked in the direction from which the song was coming. My head was completely foggy. It seemed that these voices were the best thing that had ever happened in my life. Such feelings are difficult to describe in words. You need to feel it. I timidly picked up the words of the song, although I had never heard it. "Close your eyes. Close your eyes," I repeated these words to the children's music and walked forward. The words seemed so naive to me, like a creepy children's canting rhyme, but at the same time the singing voices literally enchanted me. I wanted to scream and run away, but I couldn't. Something was controlling my body. No one was possessing me, but my actions weren't voluntary either. I wanted to wake up and understand that it was just a dream. A terrible and stupid dream that was better forgotten. And at the same time, I wanted to follow the sound of children's voices, merge with them in choral singing, clearly pronounce the words and forget who I was. Luckily, for some reason I stopped and felt my body. But where was I? It seemed like I was standing in the middle of a small clearing surrounded by trees. I felt like I had to run, but where to? Upset and tired, I squatted down like a thug. I was too tired, and my head was spinning as if I was drunk. What should I do? Tears were running down my cheeks. I scolded myself for agreeing to participate in Olka's adventure. By the way, where did Olia disappear to? I hope she simply got scared and ran home. After sitting like that for about 5 minutes, I took the camera and started clicking the trees that stood in front of me. It was very scary, so I had to distract myself from my own thoughts in such a strange way. Yes, it was not the best thing I could do, but at that moment I needed at least some actions and sounds, in addition to my breathing and the fear that was literally suffocating me. After taking about 10 pictures, I began to cry and look at the photos in some despair. Trees and grass, very interesting. The same thing again, and trees again. Stop. And what is this? Damn. For a long time I could not believe what I saw in the photo. Oh, this picture. A woman was standing among the trees. She was dressed in some kind of white rag. Her face was not visible. Only a small outline of her lips and nose could be seen if you looked closely. Her hair was dark, just below her shoulders. And that was not the scariest thing. Children were climbing on her. Little children. Babies. There were many of them. They were pale, translucent and thin. And they were all crawling towards the ghostly woman. Close your eyes and sing quietly. I'm behind you, behind your back. Something hissed disgustingly behind my back. I jumped up abruptly and ran as fast as I could. The fatigue suddenly disappeared somewhere. I didn't even think about looking back. I just ran wherever my eyes looked. I knew that it or they were running after me. I had no more strength, but I kept running and running. Frozen tears in my eyes, and my heart was pounding hard, echoing in my ears with an unpleasant ringing. But I was lucky. I ran out to a small highway. Houses were visible in the distance. Having caught my breath a little near the lantern, I ran again towards the village. When I arrived, the first thing I did was look at my watch. In the morning, I found out that Olia was just joking and hadn't come to the forest at all. In fact, she wouldn't have dared to go alone, but if there had been a group maybe. She slept peacefully all night. Olka hoped that I would get scared and run home, afraid of the dark and the forest. Yes, my friend just wanted to joke, which she wasn't very good at. And I, naive, bought it. When I got home, the first thing I did was transfer the photo to the computer and showed it in private messages to some friends. Naturally, they didn't believe me. They accused me of a prank. I still don't know what it was. Sometimes in my dreams I return to the forest and hear the ill-fated song. Only there I'm not a lost soul in the dark wilds, but that same woman. But I'm not singing to my many children. No. I'm singing to those who are looking for adventure in the night forest. Believe me, if you look for them for a long time, you can certainly find them.